The tiny prince had not swallowed a single drop of milk in 3 endless days, and every hour that passed carried him closer to death. Beneath the soaring stone ceilings of Ashcombe Palace, physicians whispered instead of speaking, servants walked as though afraid their footsteps might disturb fate itself, and candles burned day and night beside a cradle that had become a battlefield between hope and despair. The joyful cries expected after the birth of England's future duke had never come. Instead, grief settled over the ancient estate like a winter fog that refused to lift. Only 4 days earlier, the palace bells had rung to announce the arrival of an heir. Before sunset, those same bells tolled for the Duchess. Lady Isabella Ashcombe had smiled only once after hearing her newborn son's first cry. She had reached trembling fingers toward Duke Cedric Ashcombe, whispered that their little Arthur had inherited his father's eyes, and quietly slipped beyond the reach of every physician in England. Cedric had not wept during the funeral. He had stood beside her white marble tomb wearing immaculate black mourning clothes, his clean-shaven face unreadable despite the unbearable weight crushing his heart. Every noble in attendance admired his composure. None realized that inside, something had already broken beyond repair. His only purpose now rested inside a gilded cradle. Prince Arthur, the last living piece of the woman he had loved since childhood. Yet the tiny infant rejected every royal wet nurse summoned to the palace. One after another they came. Experienced mothers from noble estates. Village women praised throughout the countryside. Even women recommended personally by the Queen. Arthur refused them all. He cried until his tiny face turned crimson. He pushed away every attempt to feed him. His strength faded a little more with every passing hour. By the 3rd morning, the chief physician finally lowered his eyes. "My lord, if his highness cannot nurse soon, I fear we may lose him before another sunrise." The words echoed through the nursery with dreadful finality. Cedric looked down at his son. The baby's cries had become frighteningly weak. His tiny fingers barely moved beneath the embroidered blankets. No father should ever witness life slipping away from a child so new to the world. Cedric dismissed everyone. Silence swallowed the room. He gently lifted Arthur into his arms and rested his forehead against the baby's soft hair. "I promised your mother," he whispered hoarsely. "I promised I would protect you." The infant answered only with another faint cry. That sound shattered whatever remained of the Duke's restraint. Within the hour, Cedric abandoned every expectation placed upon a man of his rank. Ignoring protests from advisors and physicians alike, he exchanged his embroidered ducal coat for the plain garments of an ordinary traveler. Only his oldest steward knew where he intended to go, and even then Cedric accepted only one loyal guard, instructing the man to remain far behind unless danger demanded otherwise. If England's greatest duke could not bring salvation to his son from within palace walls, then he would search beyond them. Rain greeted him almost immediately. Dark clouds rolled across the countryside while relentless sheets of water soaked roads, forests, and lonely farmsteads. Horse hooves splashed through deep mud as Cedric rode from village to village asking the same desperate question. Is there a nursing mother willing to help a sick child? Most households had none. Some had mothers whose own infants desperately depended upon them. Others offered prayers instead of answers. Each disappointment tightened the knot inside his chest. Hours blurred together beneath the relentless storm. Toward evening, his horse climbed a gentle hill overlooking a forgotten riverside village where smoke drifted from crooked chimneys and worn cottages leaned against one another like weary old friends. Life here possessed none of the grandeur of Ashcombe Palace. Yet it breathed with quiet endurance. Near the riverbank, one figure remained outside despite the cold rain. A young woman knelt beside a wooden washboard, scrubbing clothes with steady hands while swollen water rushed around smooth stones nearby. Her dress was plain. Her sleeves were rolled above strong forearms reddened by icy water. Her slightly curvy figure reflected honest labor rather than luxury. Loose strands of chestnut hair escaped a simple knot, clinging to her rain-damp cheeks. She looked no older than 24. Villagers passing with baskets offered sympathetic smiles instead of conversation. Cedric noticed the strange sadness lingering behind her warm hazel eyes. She worked with the determined rhythm of someone trying to outrun unbearable thoughts. Her name was Eleanor Whitford. Only 3 days earlier she had entered childbirth believing she would finally hold the little boy she had dreamed about throughout lonely months of quiet hope. Instead, exhausted and barely conscious, she awakened to a midwife's tearful announcement that her baby had been stillborn. She had never seen his face, never touched his tiny fingers, never whispered his name. The empty cradle inside her cottage remained exactly where she had prepared it. Unable to endure staring at it, she spent every waking hour washing clothes simply to keep grief from swallowing her completely. As Cedric approached, Arthur released another fragile cry. The sound floated across the rain-soaked riverbank. Eleanor froze. Her hands stopped moving. Slowly she lifted her head. Something older than reason stirred within her aching heart. Milk she believed would never nourish a child again painfully reminded her body of what had been stolen. Without thinking, she stood and stepped closer. "May I?" she asked softly, her voice trembling almost as much as the baby. "May I hold him?" Cedric hesitated, only a heartbeat. He had exhausted pride, caution, and certainty. Only desperation remained. He carefully placed Arthur into her waiting arms. The transformation was immediate. The crying ceased. The tiny prince opened sleepy blue eyes and gazed quietly into Eleanor's face. His little hand reached upward and gently curled around one of her fingers. Every conversation in the village stopped. Even the rain seemed quieter. Eleanor looked down at the infant, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. "He isn't frightened anymore," she whispered. Then, with hesitant eyes seeking Cedric's permission, she said the words neither of them expected. "I think he wants to nurse." Minutes later, beneath the shelter of an old willow beside the river, Prince Arthur finally drank. Not reluctantly. Not briefly. Hungrily. Life returned to his tiny features with every precious swallow. Cedric watched in stunned silence as color slowly warmed his son's fragile face. His knees weakened beneath the overwhelming relief. Before the astonished villagers, England's proud duke slowly lowered himself onto one knee before the humble laundress, rain streaming from his shoulders as gratitude eclipsed every trace of noble pride. "Please," he said, his voice breaking for the first time since his wife's death. "Can you nurse my son, just once?" Eleanor closed her eyes, holding the peaceful infant against her heart as fresh tears escaped. When she finally looked back at the stranger kneeling before her, sorrow overshadowed even compassion. "I lost my own baby 3 days ago," she whispered. "And somehow, holding your son feels as though heaven is asking me not to stop." Morning sunlight spilled across the towering windows of Ashcombe Palace, yet warmth never reached its cold marble halls. Servants hurried through silent corridors carrying fresh linen, polished silver, and whispered rumors, while every noble household and residence waited eagerly to glimpse the mysterious village woman whom the Duke himself had escorted home. No one believed the stories. England's proud Duke would never lower himself before a laundress, they insisted. Such tales belonged in taverns, not within ancient walls guarded by generations of aristocratic pride. Eleanor Whitford entered through the palace gates wearing the same simple gray dress she had worn beside the river. She had accepted neither jewels nor fine clothing during the journey, insisting she had come only to help an innocent child. Her slightly curvy figure, humble posture, and work-worn hands immediately drew curious stares from liveried servants lined along the entrance hall. They bowed respectfully to their master, yet their eyes lingered upon Eleanor with unconcealed disbelief. Some whispered behind lowered heads, "She cannot possibly remain. She looks nothing like a lady. His Grace has brought home a laundress." Others were less charitable. "Far too plain. Far too heavy. The palace will become a laughingstock." Every cutting remark reached Eleanor's ears despite their attempts at secrecy. Years of ridicule had taught her how to keep walking while her heart quietly bruised beneath each insult. She lowered her gaze, refusing to answer anyone. She had not come seeking acceptance. She had come because one fragile life depended upon her. Duke Cedric noticed every whisper. His expression remained calm, but the servants nearest him instinctively stepped aside. Without raising his voice, he said, "The woman beside me is under my protection. Any insult directed toward Miss Whitford will be treated as an insult toward the House of Ashcombe itself." Silence swept through the hall. No one challenged him again. The palace physician greeted them outside the nursery with visible relief. Prince Arthur had refused nourishment during the journey until Eleanor held him once more. The moment she gathered him into her arms, his tiny body relaxed as though he had finally recognized the place where he belonged. He eagerly fed again, his small fingers curling around the fabric of her sleeve while every physician watched in amazement. "It defies reason," the oldest doctor murmured. Cedric answered quietly, "Then perhaps reason is not what saved him." As the days passed, Arthur's strength slowly returned. The frightening hollows beneath his tiny eyes disappeared. His cries softened. His breathing steadied. The nursery, once haunted by despair, gradually filled with cautious hope. Servants who had expected to prepare another funeral instead found themselves smiling whenever Eleanor quietly sang old village lullabies while rocking the little prince beside the fire. She never sang loudly. Her voice barely rose above the crackling flames. Yet Arthur listened as though every note carried perfect peace. Cedric often paused outside the nursery door after finishing affairs of state. At first he told himself he came only to check his son's condition. Soon he realized he remained longer each evening, watching Eleanor gently pace across the carpet while moonlight shimmered through lace curtains behind her. She never noticed his silent observations because every ounce of her attention belonged to the sleeping infant resting against her shoulder. One evening Arthur suddenly opened his eyes. Instead of crying, he looked directly at Eleanor. Then something extraordinary happened. The tiny prince smiled. It lasted only a heartbeat. Nevertheless, every servant in the room gasped. No one had seen him smile since birth. Eleanor laughed through unexpected tears. Cedric felt something inside his grieving heart loosen for the first time since Isabella's death. Later that night, he found Eleanor carefully mending one of Arthur's small blankets by candlelight. "You needn't repair that yourself," he said. She smiled gently without looking up. "My mother always believed broken things deserved patient hands before they deserved replacing." Cedric studied the neat stitches appearing beneath her fingers. "You speak as though blankets have feelings." "No," she answered softly. "But people do. Sometimes caring for small things teaches us how to care for wounded hearts." Her words lingered long after their conversation ended. For the first time in many months, Cedric slept without dreaming of funeral bells. Not everyone welcomed the growing peace inside Ashcombe Palace. Lady Helena Ravenscroft arrived 2 days later, draped in elegant emerald silk and carrying an expression polished by years of courtly perfection. Beautiful, intelligent, and admired throughout London's highest circles, she had long expected to become the widowed duke's second wife. She greeted Cedric with graceful sympathy, offered expensive gifts for Arthur, and embraced Eleanor with outward kindness that concealed carefully measured contempt. "My dear Miss Whitford," she said warmly, "how fortunate the prince found such devoted care." Eleanor thanked her sincerely. She never noticed Helena's calculating eyes lingering upon the child. That afternoon Helena quietly summoned the head housemaid. Within hours, whispers spread through the servants' quarters. Someone claimed Eleanor had stolen scented soap. Another insisted she secretly searched noble bedrooms after dark. By evening, a pearl brooch disappeared from a drawing room. The missing jewel was discovered beneath Eleanor's folded shawl. Several servants demanded her immediate dismissal. Eleanor stared at the brooch with stunned confusion. "I have never seen this before." Few believed her. Lady Helena sighed with carefully rehearsed disappointment. Perhaps poverty tempted her beyond reason. Before anyone could respond, Cedric stepped forward. He picked up the brooch, examined its broken clasp, then calmly asked one simple question. "If Miss Whitford hid this herself, why is yesterday's polishing wax still fresh beneath the pin?" The guilty maid responsible for planting the evidence turned pale. Minutes later she confessed everything. Helena's face never changed. Only her eyes hardened. That evening a violent thunderstorm crashed over Ashcombe. Lightning illuminated the nursery windows while thunder rolled across the estate. Arthur awoke screaming with frightened cries unlike any Eleanor had yet heard. Cedric reached the cradle first, lifting his son carefully, whispering every comforting word a desperate father could imagine. Still the baby cried uncontrollably. Then Eleanor entered, carrying only a small lantern. Arthur immediately stretched both tiny arms toward her, his tears stopping before she even touched him. Cedric slowly placed the prince into her embrace, watching his son settle peacefully against her heartbeat. Standing unnoticed beyond the half-open nursery door, Lady Helena witnessed everything, and in that silent moment she understood the greatest obstacle to her ambitions was no longer the infant heir. It was the humble laundress the palace could never accept. The rhythm of Ashcombe Palace slowly changed with Prince Arthur's recovery. Curtains that had remained drawn since the Duchess's funeral were opened each morning, allowing pale autumn sunlight to spill across polished marble floors. The servants smiled more freely. The physicians no longer exchanged hopeless glances whenever they entered the nursery. Even the ancient clock in the great hall seemed to tick with less sorrow. Wherever Eleanor Whitford walked carrying the little prince, anxious faces softened, as though hope itself had chosen to follow her through the palace. Yet Eleanor never allowed herself to forget why she had come. She was not family. She was not noble. She was simply a grieving mother whose empty arms had been given another child to protect. Every evening, after Arthur drifted to sleep, She quietly returned to the modest chamber prepared for her at the end of the servants' wing. There, hidden inside the small wooden chest she had brought from the village, rested the only keepsake she possessed from her own child, a tiny linen cap she had stitched during the final month of her pregnancy. She often held it against her heart before extinguishing the candle, wondering whether her son had truly drawn only a single breath before leaving the world. The question haunted her more fiercely with every passing day. Arthur's tiny expressions reminded her that somewhere, only in her imagination, another little boy might have smiled exactly the same way. One crisp morning, while the palace prepared for a gathering of neighboring nobles, Eleanor remained in the nursery folding freshly washed blankets. Arthur lay peacefully inside his cradle, following her movements with curious blue eyes while sunlight danced across the carved ivory rails surrounding him. As she lifted the final blanket from the cradle, something caught her attention. One corner had folded inward. A line of faded embroidery peeked through the linen. Curious, she unfolded it completely. Her breath stopped. Tiny blue forget-me-not flowers had been stitched into one edge. Beneath them rested two carefully embroidered letters. W. Her own initials. The blanket slipped from her trembling hands onto the nursery floor. No. The whisper escaped before she realized she had spoken aloud. She slowly knelt and gathered the blanket again, examining every stitch. Months before giving birth, she had embroidered dozens of tiny blue flowers onto a blanket for her baby. Her mother had taught her that forget-me-nots represented promises that survived even death. To make the gift unmistakably hers, she had hidden her initials beneath one corner where only she would ever notice them. No one else knew. No one else could have copied every imperfect stitch. This was her blanket. The very one she had wrapped around her unborn son before labor began. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it again. Arthur reached toward her with a tiny laugh, unaware that the peaceful nursery had suddenly become the center of an impossible mystery. Before Eleanor could collect herself, Duke Cedric entered carrying several letters from Parliament. He immediately noticed her pale face. What has happened? She looked at him silently before offering the blanket. Your Grace, where did this come from? Cedric frowned. It was among the prince's belongings after his birth. Who gave it to him? I assumed one of the palace seamstresses. She slowly turned the corner toward him. I embroidered these flowers. Cedric studied the stitching. Then the initials. Eleanor Whitford, he read quietly. My mother taught me this pattern when I was 12, she whispered. Every flower leans slightly to the left because I have always stitched with my left hand. No one else sews exactly this way. Cedric's calm expression faded. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence itself became frightening. Finally he asked, could another blanket simply resemble yours? She slowly shook her head. I made only one. Arthur suddenly reached toward Eleanor again, grasping the edge of the blanket with surprising determination. She stared at the tiny fingers holding what should never have existed inside Ashcombe Palace. That afternoon Cedric quietly ordered the palace steward to retrieve every record surrounding Arthur's birth. The steward returned looking uneasy. Several pages from the maternity ledger had vanished. The names of 2 attending midwives had been scratched away with fresh ink. One physician had resigned without explanation only days after the Duchess died. Another had supposedly retired abroad. Nothing about the records felt natural. Cedric requested the palace accountant. Payments made during the week of Arthur's birth revealed unusually large sums distributed to temporary attendants whose names no longer appeared anywhere in palace employment records. Someone had been paid generously. Someone had disappeared. Someone wanted every trace erased. Cedric dismissed the servants and locked himself inside his study. He spread every surviving document across his enormous desk beneath flickering candlelight. Dates contradicted one another. Signatures differed. Official seals appeared pressed over older wax. He had negotiated treaties and uncovered financial fraud during years of managing his estates, yet he had never seen records altered with such deliberate precision. This was not carelessness. It was concealment. Meanwhile, Eleanor quietly returned to the village where her child had supposedly been buried. The little cemetery overlooked rolling fields touched by autumn wind. She knelt beside the tiny grave marked only with a simple wooden cross. Fresh flowers rested there. She placed her trembling hand upon the earth. I thought I came to say goodbye, she whispered through tears. Now I don't know who lies beneath you. The elderly priest approached gently after seeing her alone. I remember your sorrow well, my child. Eleanor looked up. Father, did you ever see my baby? The priest hesitated. No. The coffin remained closed. The midwife said there had been complications. She insisted no mother should remember such sights. A cold chill traveled through Eleanor's body despite the afternoon sun. Who carried the coffin? I cannot recall. Everything happened so quickly. As Eleanor left the churchyard, she noticed someone watching from across the road. A hooded rider. The stranger turned the horse and disappeared into the trees before she could recognize a face. When she returned to the palace after nightfall, Cedric was already waiting. Without a word, he placed the altered birth records beside her embroidered blanket. Neither needed to explain what both already feared. Two unrelated pieces of evidence now pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Before either could speak, frantic knocking echoed through the study door. Cedric's captain of guards entered, breathing heavily. "My lord, we've just received alarming news. The senior midwife who attended both births agreed to meet one of our investigators tonight." Cedric stepped forward. "Where is she now?" The captain swallowed hard. "We arrived too late. She was found murdered beside the old mill. In her hand." He slowly placed a blood-stained strip of blue embroidered cloth upon the desk. It matched the missing edge torn from Eleanor's blanket perfectly. As horror settled over the room, Cedric realized the conspiracy surrounding Arthur's birth had claimed another life, and whoever had silenced the midwife already knew that Eleanor and the Duke were finally asking the right questions. Night descended upon Ashcombe Palace beneath a sky bruised by storm clouds, and every gust of wind seemed to carry another warning. Since the murder of the senior midwife, Duke Cedric had doubled the palace guard, locked every gate, and forbidden anyone from leaving the estate without his written permission. Yet despite soldiers patrolling every corridor, Eleanor sensed an invisible danger moving quietly through the ancient halls. Someone had killed to bury the truth once before. Someone would kill again. She refused to leave Prince Arthur alone. Every evening she remained beside the nursery fire until the infant drifted into peaceful sleep. His tiny chest rose and fell with reassuring steadiness, and each gentle breath strengthened her resolve. Whatever mystery surrounded his birth, none of it belonged to the innocent child smiling in his dreams. She silently promised both Arthur and the son she had never held that she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Cedric carried the same determination. Hidden inside his private study, he spread maps, witness statements, and altered birth records across a long oak table. Every clue pointed toward a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, yet one name surfaced too often to dismiss as coincidence. Lady Helena Ravenscroft had visited the palace repeatedly during the weeks surrounding Arthur's birth. She had donated generously to the hospital where Eleanor delivered her child. She had exchanged secret correspondence with one missing physician. None of it proved guilt, but together the pieces formed a shadow impossible to ignore. Before dawn, Cedric quietly instructed his captain of guards to arrest the physician if he could be found alive. The captain never returned. Instead, his horse wandered back alone shortly after sunrise, its saddle stained with blood and its reins cut cleanly in two. The palace fell into alarm. Cedric immediately ordered every entrance sealed. Lady Helena expressed elegant concern before the assembled household, offering comfort with flawless composure. Her voice never trembled. Her expression remained perfectly measured. Eleanor watched her from across the great hall and felt an unexpected chill. There was sympathy in Helena's words, yet none in her eyes. That evening rain lashed the palace windows with relentless force. Thunder rolled across the countryside. Servants hurried to shutter every window while guards checked torches along the outer walls. Inside the nursery, Eleanor rocked Arthur gently, humming the same lullaby her own mother had once sung beside humble cottage fires. The prince yawned, curled his tiny fingers around hers, and slowly surrendered to sleep. Then the smell reached her. Smoke. At first it was faint, almost hidden beneath the scent of beeswax candles. Moments later frightened shouting echoed through distant corridors. Fire. The nursery door burst open. A terrified maid stumbled inside. The west wing is burning. Almost instantly black smoke crept beneath the ceiling. Cedric rushed into the room from the opposite corridor. Eleanor, take Arthur and follow the eastern staircase. Before she could answer, a tremendous crash shook the palace. Burning beams collapsed somewhere below. The nursery windows glowed orange. Someone had set the fire deliberately. Cedric wrapped a damp blanket around Arthur while guiding Eleanor toward the exit. Halfway down the staircase another explosion of flames separated them. Blinding smoke swallowed everything. Eleanor lost sight of Cedric. She clutched Arthur tightly against her chest while coughing through the choking air. Hands suddenly reached from the darkness. Masked men. One seized Arthur. Another shoved Eleanor backward. She struck the stone wall hard enough to steal her breath. By the time she regained her footing, both kidnappers and child had vanished into the smoke. No! Her scream echoed through the burning corridors. Ignoring falling embers, she ran after them. Cedric heard her cry. Without hesitation, he plunged through collapsing flames despite guards trying desperately to restrain him. A burning beam crashed across his shoulder, but he forced it aside and continued searching room after room. Outside, horses thundered through the palace gates. 3 masked riders fled into the storm carrying a tightly wrapped bundle. Cedric emerged just in time to see them disappear beyond the forest. Within moments, he and a squad of mounted guards gave chase. Rain transformed woodland paths into rivers of mud. Lightning illuminated black trees twisting overhead. The pursuit became a desperate race between darkness and hope. Meanwhile, Eleanor refused to remain behind. Borrowing a stable horse, she followed despite every order commanding her safety. Grief had already stolen one child from her. She would not lose another. The chase ended at the ruins of an abandoned monastery hidden deep within the forest. Ancient stone walls rose from tangled ivy like forgotten ghosts. Inside the crumbling chapel, torches flickered against cracked pillars. Arthur's frightened cries echoed somewhere beyond. Cedric drew his sword. Guards spread through the ruins. Steel clashed against steel as masked kidnappers attacked from every direction. Eleanor slipped through a broken doorway while the fighting raged outside. She followed Arthur's cries into an underground chamber beneath the monastery. There she found Lady Helena standing beside the infant, her elegant gown untouched by rain, her face finally stripped of every comforting disguise. "So," Helena said calmly, "the laundress has found me." Eleanor stepped between Helena and Arthur. "Why?" Helena smiled without warmth. "Because kingdoms are inherited by survivors." She confessed everything with chilling certainty. The Duchess's difficult childbirth had presented the perfect opportunity. If Arthur died before reaching childhood, Cedric would eventually require another wife to secure the Ashcombe line. Helena had bribed physicians, corrupted midwives, and silenced witnesses. Eleanor's newborn had been stolen simply because 2 births on the same night created confusion useful enough to hide every crime. "You destroyed countless lives," Eleanor whispered. "I invested in my future," Helena replied coldly. Before Helena could flee, one wounded kidnapper collapsed nearby. Knowing death approached, he grasped Cedric's sleeve after the guards dragged him into the chamber. "It wasn't only one child," he gasped. "We were ordered to abandon the village woman's baby." Cedric leaned closer. "Where?" "The northern road. An old farming couple found him first." The man's breathing stopped. Silence filled the ruined chapel. Eleanor stared at Cedric, unable to breathe. Her child had never died. He had been alive all along. Somewhere beyond the storm, beneath another family's roof, her little boy was waiting to be found, and that impossible hope burned brighter than the monastery's dying flames. The first light of dawn found Duke Cedric Ashcombe standing beneath the broken archway of the abandoned monastery, his cloak soaked by rain that had finally begun to soften into mist. Around him, the surviving kidnappers were bound, Lady Helena Ravenscroft had been placed under heavy guard, and the last embers of the night's terrible fire faded into gray smoke. Victory should have brought relief, yet neither he nor Eleanor Whitford could celebrate. One child had been rescued. Another remained somewhere beyond the horizon, alive for all these years while his mother had believed him buried beneath cold earth. Cedric mounted his horse before sunrise. "We begin today," he said. "Not tomorrow. Not next week. We search until we find your son." Eleanor looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "You owe me nothing." He gently shook his head. "I owe you everything." The search spread across England with remarkable speed. Trusted riders carried sealed letters bearing the Ashcombe crest to magistrates, priests, village elders, and sheriffs. Every abandoned child discovered during the previous 2 years was carefully recorded. Midwives were questioned again. Forgotten inns were revisited. Carriage drivers who had traveled northern roads during the week of Arthur's birth were located one by one. Cedric refused to rely upon chance. He pursued every thread, no matter how insignificant it appeared. Lady Helena, imprisoned within the palace tower, watched her carefully built ambitions collapse. During questioning, she continued denying every accusation, but the surviving kidnappers no longer protected her. Faced with overwhelming evidence, they revealed hidden payments, secret meetings, and coded letters exchanged through traveling merchants. One confessed that Helena feared Cedric's devotion to his late Duchess would prevent any future marriage unless tragedy left him desperate for companionship. Arthur's death had been intended to break the grieving Duke completely. Eleanor's stolen child had merely become another innocent casualty buried beneath Helena's ruthless calculations. Word of the conspiracy spread quietly through noble circles. Families who had once praised Helena now refused even to speak her name. Those who had mocked Eleanor's appearance began lowering their eyes whenever she passed, ashamed that the woman they dismissed possessed greater courage than any among them. Still, Eleanor found little comfort in changing opinions. Each evening she entered the nursery where Arthur waited with outstretched arms, laughing whenever she appeared. She loved him with a tenderness that surprised even herself, yet every joyful moment carried another question. Was her own son frightened? Did he know he had once been wanted? Did anyone kiss his forehead before sleep? Those unanswered thoughts never left her heart. Nearly 6 weeks after the monastery rescue, an elderly parish priest from a remote northern village requested a private audience with the Duke. "I cannot promise this concerns the child you seek," the priest said carefully, "but years ago a farming couple brought an abandoned little boy to our chapel. They claimed they discovered him beside an overturned carriage after hearing him cry in the woods. No parents were ever found." Cedric's pulse quickened. "Take us there." The journey lasted 2 days. Rolling hills replaced crowded estates. Stone cottages dotted peaceful valleys where sheep grazed beneath endless skies. Finally the carriage stopped before a modest farmhouse surrounded by apple trees and weathered fences. An elderly couple emerged together. Thomas and Margaret Ellis. Their clothes were simple. Their hands carried the marks of honest labor. Neither displayed the slightest hint of fear upon seeing the Duke himself standing outside their gate. Margaret held the hand of a small dark-haired boy no older than 2. The child peeked shyly from behind her skirts. Eleanor forgot how to breathe. Something inside her recognized him before reason could interfere. Not because of his face. Not because of certainty. Because every instinct a mother possessed reached toward him at once. The little boy studied her quietly. Then his gaze settled upon the embroidered blanket folded carefully across Eleanor's arms. She had carried it every day since discovering the truth. Curious, he stepped closer. Tiny fingers reached toward the familiar blue forget-me-not flowers. Margaret gasped softly. "He has always slept holding a piece of cloth embroidered exactly like that." Thomas disappeared briefly inside the cottage before returning with a worn strip of blue fabric preserved inside a wooden box. Its torn edge matched the missing piece from Eleanor's blanket perfectly. No words remained necessary. Eleanor dropped to her knees. Her entire body trembled. The little boy looked uncertain for only a moment before placing one small hand against her cheek. She covered it with both of hers. "My son," she whispered. The child tilted his head. "You are crying. I've been crying for you every day." He reached forward and wrapped his tiny arms around her neck with the uncomplicated trust only a child could give. Years of grief shattered all at once. Eleanor wept openly, holding him as though the world itself might steal him again if she loosened her embrace. Cedric quietly stepped away, allowing mother and son to meet without interruption. Margaret approached him instead. "We never wished to keep him from his family," she said through tears. "We searched for months. No one claimed him. We loved him because we believed heaven had placed him in our path." Cedric bowed his head respectfully. "And heaven did. You saved his life. You will always remain part of it." Rather than separating the child from the only parents he remembered, Cedric invited Thomas and Margaret to visit Ashcombe whenever they wished. Eleanor embraced the decision immediately. Love, she realized, was never diminished by being shared. The elderly couple had protected her son when she could not. They deserved gratitude, not loss. Back at the palace, the reunion transformed every heart. Arthur crawled eagerly toward the little boy, laughing as though recognizing an old friend instead of a stranger. The 2 children began playing together within hours, sharing wooden blocks, chasing rolling balls across nursery carpets, and falling asleep side by side after exhausting themselves with innocent delight. Watching them, Cedric finally understood something that had escaped him since Isabella's death. Families were not preserved by blood alone. They were built every day through sacrifice, forgiveness, and steadfast love. Soon afterward the royal court assembled inside the grand ballroom to witness Helena's formal judgment. Nobles crowded beneath crystal chandeliers while judges recited every crime she had committed: conspiracy against the ducal succession, murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and treason. Helena stood silent as each title, estate, and privilege was stripped away. She glanced once toward Cedric, perhaps hoping for mercy. He offered only justice. "You did not merely seek power," he said calmly. "You declared war upon innocent children." She was sentenced to spend the remainder of her life imprisoned, remembered not for her beauty but for the destruction ambition had carved through countless lives. Weeks later the palace gathered again. Though this time sunlight poured through every stained glass window, musicians filled the halls with joyful melodies and flowers lined every staircase. Servants who had once whispered against Eleanor now smiled with genuine affection as she entered wearing an elegant ivory gown crafted without excessive jewels, exactly as she had requested. Cedric waited before the assembled court. When Eleanor approached, he did something no one expected. He stepped down from the dais, removed the ancient ducal ring from his finger, then slowly knelt before the woman he had first met beside a rain-swollen river. Every noble fell silent. His voice carried through the magnificent hall with unwavering conviction. "The day I begged you to save my son, I believed you answered a desperate father's prayer. I understand now that heaven answered far more than mine. You restored Arthur's life. You uncovered evil hidden within these walls. You found your own child without surrendering compassion for another. You taught this house that true nobility is measured by courage, kindness, and sacrifice rather than birth. Eleanor Whitford, there is no woman in England more worthy to stand beside me." He opened the ring box resting in his hand. "Will you become my duchess?" Tears shimmered in Eleanor's hazel eyes. She looked first at the little boy holding Margaret's hand, then at Prince Arthur smiling from his nurse's arms. Finally she looked back at Cedric. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "With all my heart." Applause erupted like thunder. Cedric rose and placed the ring upon her trembling finger before gently kissing her forehead. Months later, as church bells echoed across the kingdom, the Duke and his new Duchess stepped onto the palace balcony together. Arthur laughed from Eleanor's left arm while her long-lost son rested happily against Cedric's shoulder, already reaching for the man he had begun calling father. Below them, thousands cheered as rose petals drifted through golden afternoon sunlight. No one saw a laundress beside a duke anymore. They saw a family forged through unimaginable sorrow, defended by unwavering courage, and completed by a love strong enough to overcome grief, deceit, and destiny itself. In that unforgettable moment, Ashcombe House finally became a home again,